This session is titled Ideas and Narratives, and we have a panel of eminent scholars, experts, to deliberate upon the nuanced intricacies of the subject matter. The session will be chaired by Professor Mumin Chen, Deputy Representative, Taipei Economic and Cultural Center, New Delhi, and Professor of International Politics at the National Chung University, Taichung. Our speakers, we start with Professor Alka Acharya. It is a matter of great honor for me to introduce Professor Acharya. A lot of you already know her, a scholar who brings forth both depth and nuance in her research and a person of grand magnanimity. Our second speaker is Mr. Tuvia Gering, a researcher at the Israel-China Policy Center, Institute for National Security Studies, Tel Aviv. He is also a non-resident fellow, Global China Hub, Atlantic Council at Washington, D.C. Dr. Anand P. Krishnan will be our third speaker. He is a visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and guest course instructor at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. The papers in order of speakers. Professor Acharya's paper is titled Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, a Teleological Analysis. Mr. Tuvia Gering's paper is titled The Role of Intellectuals in Constructing China's International Discourse Power. Dr. Anand's paper is titled Class, Politics, Labor and the Party in the New Era. Our lead discussant will be Professor Ravni Thakur, who is a professor at the Department of East Asian Studies, the University of Delhi, a highly articulate professor, a great teacher, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you. Sir, the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Namaskar. I'm very, very happy to be here today. This is my first time to come to ICS conference in Goa. And so also my first time to Goa. I should say that you choose the best place for conference. Yeah, yeah, and you know, in China every year before the September day when they have the Party Congress, not every year but every 4 years, they went the leaders they went to Beidaihe. Yeah, they went to Beidaihe. Yeah, it's not a place of vacation. It's a place for making big decisions. Yeah, yeah. So when you are in the sitting in the beach, and you have a breeze, warm climate, and good food, then you have a clear mind. You made the right decisions. So, yeah. So in China they have a Beidaihe conference. In India we have a Goa forum. Yeah. Okay. We study China here in Goa every year. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You know, I'm from Taiwan now, working at TCC in Delhi. But I'm also a scholar of international relations. This session, the topic is the narratives and ideas. When we study China or study Chinese politics, ideologies are very important. Yeah. Let me give you one example. It's based on my own experience. 20 years ago, when I was a PhD candidate doing my dissertation, I went to Beijing. And my dissertation topic was about Chinese foreign policy under the reform era. And I found out that a lot of the Chinese, their interpretation of the outside world, actually, we know that China started economic reform in 1978. And then, but actually I found a lot of things that actually changed after 1985. I don't know why, because I want to know what's the critical, what's the reason that behind such a change. And then I interviewed Chinese scholars. They told me that you have to know 世界格局. 世界格局, if you know Chinese or study Chinese politics, you will know it's a little bit difficult to translate into English. In Chinese literature, they translate into world patterns. World patterns. World is 世界, and 格局, they call it patterns. International relations student, you know that we study international system. Yeah, bipolarity, unipolarity, multipolarity. But when Chinese people, they talk about 世界格局 or world pattern, they do not just talk about polarity. They also talk about strategic interactions, between greater powers. And how, but the most important is how Chinese leaders, they see the world in that way. Yeah. So then I try to, they say, okay, you read Deng Xiaoping. So I went to read the Deng Xiaoping selected works. I found out that Deng Xiaoping said very clearly in 1985, they say now the world pattern has changed. Before 1985, all Chinese literature, when they talk about world pattern, it's an age of a war and a revolution. In 1985, Deng Xiaoping say, now this is a world of a peace and development. Okay, so they open up after 1985. So this example tells us that ideas, ideologies, they play a more important role in shaping Chinese foreign policies and also even domestic policies. So certain concepts, certain issues like socialism with Chinese characteristics, what is that? Yeah, or Chinese dream. Okay, what is Chinese dream about? For us, it doesn't make any sense. But if you are in Chinese context, yeah, these are extremely important for people like Xi Jinping, to consolidate their political authority and legitimacy in the society. Yeah, so today, this session, we talk about narratives and ideas. We have three presenters. And I'm glad that actually they all talk in a little bit different ways. Yeah, so, and after that, we will have Professor Thakur to discuss the three presentations. Okay, so let's start. Professor Alka, please.
So good afternoon, and thank you, Chair, for actually introducing my topic in many ways by foregrounding the role and importance and significance of ideology in understanding China. Now, so it goes without saying that a fundamental premise in my paper here is that it is necessary to take the Communist Party's ideological formulations and propositions seriously, and how they choose to interpret them at different periods. So that's really where I start from. And my paper would seek to examine this formulation of socialism with Chinese characteristics in a historical context. That is, of course, the larger context is this matrix of cynicization of Marxism that now spans a century. But as Professor Chen pointed out, that 78, Deng Xiaoping starts to reform, but for him the changes come about in 85. Why is that? So the approach that I have adopted is teleological in the philosophical sense. What I mean is that I intend to focus on the objectives or the purposes which formulations or propositions from the CPC's ideological corpus are intended to serve. So I'm really not looking at the causes or the factors which led to that conceptualization, but the purposes which it is intended to serve. A caveat here, my paper attempts to examine the discourse. So that's one side of the coin. I mean, the other side of the coin, which is a much bigger challenge and which is outside of the scope of this paper just yet, is to make a critical analysis of what the socialist project or socialism means in China today. And that's really going to be a very different kind of a teleological exercise. How socialism with Chinese characteristics is intended to lead China to its goal, ultimate goal. So my paper will address the emergence of this concept in the post-Mao period, when particularly with the commencement of the Tang era, when socialism with Chinese characteristics becomes the centerpiece of the Tangist framework in the context of the market reforms. I will beg your indulgence because this is going to be a slightly old-fashioned kind of paper which will go into ideology from an academic perspective. Now, it was at the 13th Party Congress in 1987 that, in tandem with this concept of the primary stage of socialism, Socialism with Chinese characteristics becomes the basis of a fundamental, far-reaching restructuring of domestic policy. And that led to yet more far-reaching changes in Chinese foreign policy, as Professor Chen mentioned, from war and conflict to peace and development. So these things are kind of linked. And socialism with Chinese characteristics under Xi Jinping is yet again enshrined as the leitmotif of the ideological corpus that is now being unveiled. So the point here is that the systemic significance of socialism with Chinese characteristics is very clearly emerging over this long period in terms of its role as a guide to the party to build a strong, rich, and powerful socialist state. As Xi Jinping himself said in the report to the 20th Party Congress, we must apply systems thinking. All things are interconnected and interdependent. We must view them with the understanding that they are universally connected, part of a complete system, and constantly evolving if we are to grasp the laws governing their development. Simply put, the communists think in terms of laws of history. As Mao Zedong used to articulate very often, that the systemic conflict in the world at that point between capitalism and socialism was bound to end in the collapse of the capitalist system, because that was the telos of history. Now the question that I pose, and of course I do not have a complete answer, is that it's obvious that much has changed in China over the last 30 years. Has this perspective on the sacrosanctity or sanctity, if you will, sacredness of historical laws also changed? Is China in the 21st century equally guided by this notion of the telos, of the eventual defeat of the capitalist system, and in their race to outdo the Americans in this globalization game, do they actually still subscribe to that telos? And this is at a time when I find, going through the discourse, and I really like Ravni's point on this, the use of the term ideology has once again reverted in most of the prominent Western writings to its Cold War usage. So ideology therefore becomes the enemy. And hence the CPC under Xi Jinping do seem to, like the American policymakers one may add, locate the chief contradiction in the ideological arena. And this has led to a situation where there is a tension between the system-oriented view of IR and the power-oriented view of IR. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that and see where we go. So power matters to the extent that the defense of the system requires that capability of power. So in the both material and technological sense, the role of power becomes very critical. And China's state power is as much about the power of the socialist state in the sense of the IR hierarchy as well. So with the commencement of the building of socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, the question is whether we can still maintain that power has mainly systemic significance, and whether the CPC continues to take a similar view of the adversary's power. And another caveat here, that is, obviously this concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics has originated in the cause of an adaptation of Marxism to the Chinese context. In most of the writings, we see a linear progression, that is to say, Mao liberated, Tang made China rich, and now Xi Jinping is going to make China powerful. So is that what the adaptation is all about? Or, as I had mentioned in the morning, that would the framework of a thesis leading to an antithesis by Tung, and a synthesis would be a better way. The point I'm making here is that by identifying these concepts with these individuals, we need to be clear that these concepts are held by the party as a whole, and which has seen different handling and different treatment under different leaders. So one man at the helm controlling the entire narrative or the idea is actually not very helpful in appreciating the enormous shift in the nature and the functioning of the party. We heard a lot of talk about factions in the party and how they are contending in this new era as well. But I wonder, in the context of this debate on socialism with Chinese characteristics and in the context of the change in the nature of the party since the 21st century, the last 20 years definitely, would the idea of factions be better grasped if we were to see them in terms of vested interests, which are pushing and pulling the party in different directions? Their connections with global capital, their connections with the hierarchy down to the ground, down to the grassroots, and more particularly, how the entire ecosystem is being shaped by the contribution of the intellectuals in promoting this discourse, and I look forward to listening to Tuvia on that. We go back to socialism with Chinese characteristics under Deng Xiaoping, and it is very interesting that it is the intellectuals which actually helped shape this discourse throughout the 1980s, when socialism with Chinese characteristics was first propounded. Most famously, Xue Muqiao, who developed this, who gave this idea of underdeveloped socialism. And then, of course, Yu Guangyuan, who was there as head of CAS. They shaped this entire discourse on primary stage of socialism and socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so it was that at the 13th Congress, Party Congress of the CPC in October 1987, Chao Tse-yang, the premier at that point of time, gave it as the official formulation, that China was in the primary stage of socialism, building socialism with Chinese characteristics. And he positioned it as the middle road. So on the one hand, he pointed to the mistaken, quote unquote, mistaken right thinking, which meant mechanistic, dogmatic supporters of classical Marxism. And on the other hand, the mistaken leftist, let's not forget the cultural revolutionary context, mistaken leftist thinking, primarily utopian proponents of a very radicalized version of what Mao was all about. So for Chao Tse-yang, the middle road emerges from his recognition that China is neither following the capitalist road nor acting as if it can instantaneously become a developed society. Therefore, China is in the primary stage of socialism. But this is not primary stage in the general sense. It is in the general sense that this is a phase that every country which is trying to build socialism will necessarily go through. It is in a particular sense that Chao Tse-yang uses it. The specific stage China must go through while building socialism under conditions of backward productive forces, underdeveloped commodity economy. And so he makes this historic claim that building socialism in a big, backward, eastern country like China is something new in the history of development of Marxism. We cannot blindly follow what the books say, nor mechanically imitate. So now let's see the distance that has been traveled from 1987, when Chao declares that this is something new for China, and this is specific to the Chinese conditions, to Xi Jinping saying today that there is now a Chinese road to modernity, implicitly putting out the idea that there is a Chinese model after all, and that China would lay the foundations of Marxism for the 21st century. That's what we get out of the report. Tang's formulation had argued that China's actual conditions, which integrated principles of Marxism, adhered to the four cardinal principles, would make economic development the central task. And in 1987, in Chao Tse-yang's speech, it was said that China will resolve the primary contradiction of the present stage, which is between growing material and cultural needs of the people, backward production. 30 years later, Xi Jinping says, as socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era, the principal contradiction facing Chinese society has evolved. We now face the contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development. So, Chow's contradiction was between growing backward production, so in one sense that comes back, unbalanced and inadequate development, and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. In Chow's formulation, it was the other way around. And I find that rather interesting, that this inversion of the contradiction, which mostly was the same as. So the question really that comes is that coming out of Chao Tse-Yang's and Deng Xiaoping's perspective at the 13th Party Congress, was this the middle road that Deng Xiaoping opened up for his successors? Not quite. It was essentially sought to be propounded as amalgamating Marx, Lenin on the one hand and Mao, and sort of bringing out a middle road, but it does not quite seem to be the case, because ultimately the Deng Chao formulation goes on the side of the productive forces, that these are the decisive factors in social development. So productive forces are prioritized, not production relations, which actually shape the nature of the socialist society. And here is where the great divergence or the great departure comes about. Chow's speech concluded by saying, whatever is conducive to the growth of productive forces is in keeping with the fundamental interests of the people, and therefore needed by socialism. So clearly the idea of socialism that emerges from the mid-80s onwards is something that is not really integrated into the developmental process. Primary stage of socialism sought to give a time frame of at least 100 years before China would reach the developed advanced levels, and when it would eventually find its way towards communism. So socialism as an ultimate telos, and the formulation of primary stage of socialism and socialism with Chinese characteristics are really quite divorced and have nothing to do with the actual policies in the present. Okay, now I'm just going to very quickly encapsulate Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao periods, and if we go through their respective reports at the successive party congresses, we will see that this framework continues to be in place very much, with minor changes, but essentially it is the same. And in the 18th Party Congress, when Hu Jintao gave the report, in that he gave the various steps that Mao had actually introduced the concept. Deng Xiaoping established the conditions which enabled to put it in place. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao actually translated it to move towards the 21st century, and of course Xi Jinping says this is the new era. The condition, okay. Oh, I told you to tell me at 8 minutes. Well, right now I have to conclude. I've far exceeded the time I was supposed to. So if we look at Xi Jinping's report, China is still in the primary stage of socialism. However, when we take the entire set of prescriptions that he gives to implement this, it's a series of empirical measures which are set in the framework of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the fact is that basically the nature of China's achievements in the economic field, its economic rise and so on, which are obviously much appreciated world over, have come at a great price. The highest levels of inequality anywhere in the world. China ranks among the poorest countries in terms of per capita GDP. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top 20% of the population, but especially among the top 1%, and of course the phenomenal corruption which has stemmed from this basic reality that the CPC is no longer just a political entity but an economic entity which has a direct interest in the accumulation of capital. And this claim to building socialism with Chinese characteristics, that CPC is the only organization that can hold China together, has also boiled down to a near total domination and regulation of resources, which including labor, on which Anand will be speaking. So basically, we have come to the core contradiction of socialism with Chinese characteristics already. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
To the organizers for this great event, and Professor Jacob, Professor Honorary, for the very kind invitation. I'm really humbled to be here with such great colleagues and friends and representatives of the military even. And today I was asked to talk about the role of intellectuals in constructing China's international discourse power. And usually when most of us think about intellectuals in China, the first image that comes to mind is that of the Stoic Confucian, right? That's the people that's supposed to speak truth to power. And whenever the leadership veers off course, then they point them in the right direction. Some of these intellectuals, these Confucians, they would even be willing to put their life in peril and those of their families if they believed that the regime, the ruler, acts against the will of the people, the will of the polity, and the rule of heaven. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about a very important role of intellectuals in China. And this is also a role that existed for thousands of years, even since the days of the shamans, of the Shang dynasty. And that is the role of storytellers. And I'd like to focus on the greatest storyteller of them all alive today, and that is Xi Jinping, of course. And most of us know Xi Jinping as the president of China, arguably has two more important roles as the general secretary of the party and the Central Military Commission chairman. But he also has a fourth hat, and that is the hat of storyteller-in-chief. And we saw it just recently in Bali 2 weeks ago. If you've seen some of the videos and some of the reports. So not something to write home about, really, but for the People's Daily, the party's mouthpiece, they describe Xi Jinping as the chief raconteur. He is the lively narrator, quote, of China's story. 生动熏书者. President Xi Jinping captivated foreign dignitaries. And if you are a certain leader of a certain Canadian country, then you're probably enthralled by Xi Jinping's storyteller at the time. But the point is that this is something that is very important to the party state media to highlight, to illustrate. Xi Jinping is described as the man of the book. For example, a few years ago, they published a list of all the hundreds of books that he read, including Das Kapital 3 times. I mean, who read Das Kapital? Come on, even Marx's mother wouldn't read that book. But he read it 3 times, and he also a writer of books. So this year alone, he published over 10 monographs. Okay, it takes me ages to write a 6,000 word newsletter, and this guy publishes 10 monographs a year, so talk about the overachievers. So this is clearly a guy who's supposed to be a man of the book, a storyteller, a raconteur. And his story begins exactly this week, 10 years ago, when he was selected for the first time as the general secretary of the party. And the first place he decided to take the leadership, as we all know, was the National History Museum in Beijing. And there they had an exhibition called Road to Rejuvenation. And that is where he unveiled the title of his story, The Chinese Dream, 中国梦. A year later, in 2013, Xi Jinping gave the keynote speech at the Central Propaganda and War Conference. And that is also where he introduced more concepts that are very germane to our topic. Telling the China story well, 讲好中国的故事. That is also where he talked about a 舆论斗争, a public opinion discourse, a struggle over discourse, and the idea of discourse power, aka the right to speak internationally. And we'll delve more into that in a minute. So as you all know, for every good story, there has to be 4 elements. There have to be a protagonist, an antagonist, a conflict, and then a resolution. So the protagonist, the hero of our story, is in the title, of course, Zhongguo. It's the centerpiece of our story, China. The antagonist, on the other hand, changes over the years. But today, the antagonist, if you follow Chinese media closely, is also pretty easy to guess. It is Mei Xifang, US-led West. And the conflict, now here we need a bit of a context, so let's take a step back. The conflict talks about Chinese historiography called the 3 afflictions, the San'ai. And in this story, they describe the history of the Chinese Communist Party in 3 generations in general. The first generation is that of Mao Zedong, and he was able to resolve the first out of the 3 afflictions, is Aida, being beaten. And it was Mao Zedong that made the Chinese people, 起来了, rise up. And then his successor, Deng Xiaoping, he resolved the second affliction, 挨饿, being starved. And he made them from an abject country to the 2nd largest economy. Now, under the new era, we reach the 3rd and final chapter of our story, that of General Secretary Xi Jinping. And he will be able to resolve the 3rd and final affliction, 挨骂, being scolded. Because the evil enemy, the powerful enemy, Qiangdi, right now they hold the microphone, okay? They have the discourse power to control the narratives, to contain China's rise. And now we need to think of the resolution of a story. The resolution would be the most amazing story ever told. And who doesn't love a comeback story? From humiliation of 100 years to national rejuvenation. And Xi Jinping, a hero, will make China great again. 国之大者. And you know, every book has cover, right? Every hand has a glove, and every storyteller has an audience, right? A storyteller is nothing without the good audience. So who is the audience of our story, of the China story? So we have a twofold answer. First, it is internal. That is the Chinese themselves, the people inside the house. Xi Jinping believes that China being rich after Deng Xiaoping, having this material foundation, is not enough for a country. For a country to be strong, to be rich, it also needs the spiritual foundation. And that is why he talked about in the 20th Party Congress report that we must, and Professor Acharya alluded to, we must develop socialist culture with Chinese characteristics if we are to create a modern socialist nation in every way. And this is the idea. Right now, there's a hollow shell, very big shell, that is empty inside. And for Xi, this is a battle over ideas, and he wants to forge the heart of the country, quote, and the soul of the nation, also quote. He also wants, in the 20th Party Congress, to increase the cultural self-confidence, 文化自信, boost the spiritual power of China, consolidate a shared ideological foundation, to create a united struggle. And most importantly, this all boils down to control. And this is where we talk about the second audience, not just internal, but also external. And this is us, people who are not from the mainland. And control is something that is very important to see, of course. The chairman of everything sits over all these small committees. And the most important thing for him, if you put yourself in his shoes, is to think that the powerful enemy right now holds the microphone, and it is able to dictate everything we think about in China. And to Xi Jinping, this is completely unacceptable. We want the world to understand what we want them to understand, quote. Chinese stories need to be told by the Chinese themselves. And that is why he says in the report, and also before in a couple of articles he wrote for Qiushi, we must accelerate the development of Chinese discourse and narrative systems, effectively communicate the voice of China, and portray a credible, lovable, and respectable image of the country. Because it really is. It is a great country, and you just don't realize it because the West has been brainwashing you. So Xi Jinping as the chief raconteur, the chief storyteller. He is all-powerful, of course, especially now after the Congress, but he cannot do everything by himself. And that is why he also talked about in the 20th Party Congress on the need to cultivate and develop a pool of talents in philosophy and social sciences. And that is what we can also call intellectuals or establishment intellectuals, perhaps. But the point is, another thing he talked about in the Congress is the need to establish the three great systems, 三大体系. And they are a disciplinary system, an academic system, and a discourse system. And that is an idea that he started talking about in 2016. He first introduced it at the symposium on work of philosophy and social sciences. And the audience during that event was very special. He talked about the Hoqi Zhixiu, the rising stars among Chinese intellectuals from all across the board. Top Marxist scholars, theorists, nationally renowned intellectuals, experts, journalists, think tankers, students, all selected, handpicked by the party to listen to the chief raconteur when he gives them the mission. And notably, he said in the symposium back then that these people, they need to improve the Chinese populace thinking ability, to increase their spiritual character, to increase their civilizational qualities, and embody the nation's comprehensive national power and international competitiveness. Because a nation without a thriving natural science sector cannot lead the world. As we all know, technology and science, as you mentioned before, is very important. But the same holds for nations without a thriving philosophy and social science sector. And I want to end with three examples, a recommendation and a warning. So the three examples of where we see these intellectuals being mobilized is first in the media sector, which is very obvious, and also it's the topic of tomorrow's one of the discussions, so I won't get into details. But please remember that in tomorrow's session when we talk about the role of media and propaganda. The second project, which is relatively new, so some of you might have not heard of it, is a codex. So as you know, the Qing dynasty, there was a very famous project, is the Yongle Zidian. It's the Yongle Dictionary or a codex, where they try to aggregate all the greatest all the greatest achievements in knowledge ever produced in China into one single library. And now Xi Jinping, as the Qing, he also wants to have his own Zidian. He also wants to have a whole compilation, and this is a compilation that tells the story of national rejuvenation. And so it's called the Rejuvenation or Revitalization Library. And it is a codex of 300 volumes that talk about this exact story. And he wrote the foreword to it, also translated to English, so you can find it on Google. And that's the second big project. And the third is the Origin Tracing Project of the Chinese civilization of 5,000 years of history that has not been stopped. And this is something that he talked about in the May study session, the 39th study session of the Politburo, where he brought the head of that project from CAS, Wang Wen, and they've been working on this project to excavate all the relics of China's history all over the mainland into one compelling story that tells this story of a Chinese civilization that is great, that never stopped, ever, and all the minorities under its rule belong to this great integrated polity. And that's why stories also meet reality. It's not just academic discourse or something we talk about here now as words, because they really affect reality. And we saw that during Xi Jinping's visit to Xinjiang in July, where he talked about this exactly. We should make full use, that's what he says, effective use of historical facts, archaeological objects, cultural heritage, and exchange between various ethnic groups in Xinjiang to prove that the region was inhabited by many ethnic groups that has been an integral part of China since ancient times. And these various groups in Xinjiang have been important members of the big Chinese family in will and woe. Same thing can be said to our Taiwan compatriots, of course. And this is where stories meet reality and become a very serious topic. And I'll end with the recommendation and a word of advice or warning, also quoted from Xi Jinping's 20th Party Congress. We must adhere to the principle of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, quick round of thanks to ICS, CAS, and Goa University for this conference, for this forum, and also for inviting me to speak. So when I was making my preparations for this presentation, I was actually wondering about how to go about it and how to put it in front of such an audience. What would be the examples to actually cite? And I was actually wondering and going about it in a sort of a dilemma. Then actually things actually play out in China. So the last 1 month, this best illustration of what labor, class, and state is best captured in what is happening or what has happened in Foxconn, Chengzhou. Right from workers' exodus in the first round in late October, to the state in a call of arms duty, calling up and mobilizing cadre to actually work, in fact terming it as even a national duty for short-term employment in the assembly line, and then the final riot that actually takes place. So this actually, whatever is what I'm speaking is best encapsulated by that incident. Moving on, what I in the new era to look at labor, the two important features which in my opinion is what are the two salient features of labor is one is laissez-faire, the state's laissez-faire attitude towards labor, and the other arm of the state is heavy repression. And this, over the period, there has been a precipitous decline in status of workers in China. From once being very active stakeholders in the industrial system, being directly participatory in terms of management and even decision making, what sociologist Joel Andreas calls as industrial citizenship, it has moved to the labor becoming hired hands. So there's a consistent amount of political disenfranchisement of labor which has happened through years, and in fact this is more acute now in the new era since 2012, but I think as I move forward in my presentation, I'll also show that a lot of the roots also lie in post 1978 reform and opening up. Particularly in the new era, the state's relationship vis-a-vis labor is a very calculated one, which is rooted purely in the extraction of workers' value. To note two examples, one would be right from Xi Jinping's 2017 Party Congress report in 18th, where he talks about the need to build an educated, skilled, innovative workforce, foster respect for model workers, quality workmanship, and work ethic. So this is a thing where he's actually looking at self-improvement of workforce. And in moving forward, even when you come to the Common Prosperity speech, which was a thing in last year, in the CPC centenary year, he calls for requirement of high-quality workers for high-quality development and upgradation of human capital. Again, this also extends into his political report at the 20th Congress. In fact, part 5 of that report, especially section 4, there's a lot of mention for high quality. I mean, there is a constant mention throughout the report, but especially in that section, high quality is something which he is giving a lot of prominence. There's a lot of scholarship which has looked at in terms of how states have turned and how resources are developed or provided with the global neoliberal turn. And this talks about and what Xi Jinping is actually also talking about is also in line with a neoliberal idea of a citizen in whom human capital must be invested to develop his or her full potential. So basically, in terms of developing of this quality is to make sure that they're employable. So it's, in fact, in the report also he says about an employable workforce or developing an employable workforce. What it does in this kind of a reading of labor is what happens is the labor's social and organic character is completely defanged and it is made congruent to economic development. And this also reflects in the state's real negativity and irritation towards welfare redistribution. I mean, Xi in his Common Prosperity speech very strictly says that no excessive guarantees, even if China reaches a higher level of development, and even if China in the future acquires strong resources, you should not be putting in guarantees. In fact, he also terms as the party should be, or the state should, party state should be careful of not falling into the trap of nurturing lazy people. Again, this also builds into the narrative under neoliberalism, where you have the fact that encumbrances like redistribution is actually seen as anathema to economic growth. In fact, in the new era where the party leads everything, I believe that has negatively impacted labor. And in fact, one of the biggest examples for that is the China's primary trade union, the All China Federation of Trade Unions. Its operation has been severely constricted in the country. It has, in fact, is a mass organization, but over the years, which has had a double identity as both a worker organization and also part of the state. So the essential Leninist concept of a transmission belt, where you take the interests of the workers and inform the state, and then you take the state's thing and get into to inform the workers. This kind of a transmission belt has over time become only a one-way kind of a street. In fact, there has been little to no autonomy in initiatives or functioning for the primary trade union. It has completely been subordinated to the party. In fact, Xi Jinping in 2018, when the CFTU had its conference, he had made this remarks that the trade union's primary loyalty should be with the party, and it should uphold the party's leadership. In fact, even in Chinese history, if you look at it post 1949, there have been 3 phases where the trade union had tried to have its some amount of independent functioning. The last such phase was in '89, when in the student movement at Tiananmen, when there was also trying to also have some kind of an alliance with the workers. Then the primary trade union had sort of tried to have some kind of operational space, but that was also dumbed down. The first was in the early 1950s, when again there was an effort to get some kind of autonomous space for independent kind of functioning under Li Lisan, which was also seriously discouraged. So this is as far as trade union concerned. The other aspect which is much very clear since 2012 is a very heightened regime of repression. I mean, serious crackdown on workers or labor activists, support groups. So the state basically brutally crushes any kind of bottom-up self-organizing or autonomous activities. So to connect this new era, as I said, is also too important that there's a continuum which happens, so you cannot see only it in the new era, because a lot of the roots lie after China opened up or the economic reforms of '78. And what has basically been the party state's model is to continue this economic production or economic growth, which is actually gives the party state the legitimacy. The important thing to do that is to ensure stability and industrial peace. So what the state has been doing, the party state has been doing, its playbook has been simultaneous deployment of both its responsive capacities, which is to give concessions or welfare concessions from time to time, even allowing some kind of experimentation in kind of trade union elections and so forth. But on the other hand, you also have this repressive capacity, which is to severely crush protests or contention with public security apparatus. So in fact, to go about this, in early 2000, in the Hu One era, there was a strike wave which happened, a range of protests which happened across the country that also put pressure on the Chinese state to introduce a raft of pro-labor measures. And so the attempt was to absorb conflicts legally and move from, say, a social contract to more of a labor contract. Also, you have to remember, this is also the time when China is making its entry into the WTO. So they had to also have laws in place which make them align with or what requirements of the WTO to, so that also is part of this narrative. And so when you have the legal absorption of workplace conflicts, what it essentially does, or what the state is also trying to do, is to actually individualize labor conflicts and move that collective contention out. And what the state does is, in such a way, is that it prevents possibilities for very durable, coordinated, collective mobilizations. And what you have in China post these concessions and with both these repressive and the responsive capacities of the state, is you have a very top-down paternalistic of the central party state. So you provide these things where the workers do not have any agency in actually drafting or helping or providing or making demands for these welfare. It is handed down or by the party from the top. And it also works for the party state's benefit. So one of the analysis of why labor movements in China do not have durability or do not spread across, but it's mostly confined to workplaces, is because it shields the central party state from the IR, because it provides these kinds of top-down, and then it is essentially directing all of it vis-a-vis the employer or towards the local state, and it kind of completely insulates the central party state. It is also important to look at it in terms of why this happens in terms of class and class analysis. So there has been over time, ever since the reforms have happened, there has been significant de-emphasis of class antagonisms. The 12th Party Congress talks about how the era of class struggle is is completely over. Its contradictions are no more antagonistic contradictions, as Mao's terminology goes. It then moves on to the 13th National Congress, which Professor Acharya did mention, where development of productive forces becomes the central task. So whatever is conducive to growth or what is adopted and what is detrimental is not allowed to exist. So this de-ideologization of the political economy, which a range of incentives, actually makes China a very class-divided society, which is embedded within a Leninist state. So, and increasingly over time, this de-emphasis on class has also reflected in how it has been subsumed within an economic discourse, which actually emphasizes individualism, professionalism, and market. And of course, the final thing of it is, which develops, is the theory of three represents, which brings in the entrepreneurial class within the party fold under Jiang Zemin. In fact, this contradiction also plays out that, in fact, one of the strongest defenders of the economic globalization in its current form is China. It's best reflected in Xi Jinping's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2017. Finally, this quickly to point out how this also has affected the membership of the party in terms of cadre recruitment. Brodsgard calls this the turn from a mass party into a very elite party, the shrinking role of workers and peasants. In fact, the 2,296 delegates at the 20th Congress, only 192 were classified as workers, which is roughly about 84%. In fact, they had 26 migrant workers as representatives, but the role of migrant workers into the party fold is extremely less. Over the years, there has been decline in overall party membership in what was displayed last year on the 100th anniversary, that you had 96 million and less than 33% of that is actually blue-collar workers and peasants. And finally, in the higher echelons of the leadership, what you have is completely where the chairman of the primary trade union remains only as member of the central committee. So he is never, I mean, the present one, Wang Tongming, there was only one instance of the chairperson, Ni Shifu, who was made also a Politburo member. Otherwise, the chairman of the trade union always remains only at the level of the central committee. And finally, what it looks for labor and China today, in terms of how the CPC looks at labor, I would say it is mostly in form of crisis mitigation. Labor is actually treated more as a law and order problem rather than any serious contradiction that needs to be reassessed seriously by a vanguard party which claims to represent workers and peasants. So Xi's ideological formulation, now that ideology becomes so important and the party's role, and she constantly is emphasizing on that. Unfortunately, those formulations completely gloss over some of the key concepts of what a vanguard communist party with the philosophy of Marxism-Leninism is about emancipation of the working class, redistribution. These are concepts which are completely been thrown out of the window. So this is somehow a vanguard party sticking to status quoism is somehow looking antithetical, which is antithetical to programs and policies of a vanguard party. And to finally end, what I believe over the years, what China today is from the perspective of labor, it is less Marxist and more Leninist when it comes to discipline, command, and control. So, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Intellectual domain, policy making, and discursive narrative formation. All three very, very interesting papers and obviously raise a lot of questions. And let me start first with Professor Acharya's paper, which I thought, was leading to some very, very interesting conclusions. And Alka, I think I would really like to start by saying, I think one of the things that you notice, if we're looking at a teleology, first of Marxism and then Chinese Marxism and ideas of socialism, I think you see a shift during Mao. Mao was his own ideologue. And you see a shift from Mao's time to the Tang and now in the post-Tang period in terms of what becomes the theoretical subject of discourse during Mao's time. And this will link into your paper as well in terms of labor. Labor is the key category of theoretization, labor rights, class war, class revolution. Mao, whether it's the Great Leap Forward, whether it's his attitude to intellectuals, the formative category is the problematization of labor, class war, and ultimately the complete faith and belief, which doesn't change in the teleology of Chinese Marxism, the superiority of the socialist system. I don't think that changes. And the other thing that doesn't change, irrespective, Tang demonstrates this quite ably when he crushes Tang, the student movement in '89, is the leadership and unquestionable leadership of the party. I think these are two that you will find. What you find happening in the Tang and post-Tang period is that the theoretical issue becomes capital and the role of capitalism. Capitalist modes of production. Tang argues within the domain of Marxism, actually using historical materialism, if you read him, that capitalism is a necessary stage of development. Socialism is not shared poverty. Socialism is the development of productive forces. And for that, a Chinese-style socialism, which allows a market economy. The two problematic conceptual issues remain private property and capital. And then, of course, the secondary superstructural influences of capitalism, the spiritual pollution, Western ideas, democracy, the Enlightenment, Western thought that Marxism, both European and Chinese, opposes quite at a theoretical level. So I think that is something that the reformulation of what is the subject of analysis, and that is why productive forces, like you pointed out from Trouser Young time, anything that proves that, and that impacts labor too, as you rightly pointed out. And I think there can be no doubt at all that the class that is truly dethroned is labor. You do find, quite interestingly, just prior to the COVID lockdown, a couple of years before then, one of the most vocal groups supporting labor rights was a Marxist student forum from Beijing University. And they were all arrested. Some of them are still missing. So again, the problematization of what is. That is why under Hu Jintao, to come to a discursive reformulation, you have harmonious society. What is harmonious society if not a contradiction of the Maoist continuous revolution? So I think those changing domains with, again, capital remaining the prerogative. And like you pointed out, Alka, the first stage of socialism is really 100 years. Now, that in itself, needs to ask, we need to ask some questions. But Alka, in terms of a question and something I think that, we need to all sort of look upon, when we talk about Chinese-style socialism, or you're going to articulate or theorize Chinese-style socialism, there is a very definite, especially under Xi Jinping, Huntingtonian categorization to that, the specificity, the superiority of the Chinese civilization. That's also why Xi is, to a certain extent, talking spiritualism, which is, again, Chinese characteristics. And this is where, I'd like to, I don't want to take up too much time, so I think that's a question that I would like to, do you see this civilizational discourse that has become dominant the world over. We've had, you know, China itself calls itself a civilization. India calls itself a civilization. So do you think this is also to a certain extent more than, you know, the teleology of Marxism or socialism, the teleology of Chinese civilization in terms of Fuqiangguo, the rich and powerful country, which really goes back to the May 4th. And prior to 1909, when the Hsing New Youth magazine first comes out as a reformist, as a critique of traditional culture, what is Fuqiangguo? So I think this would be interesting to see to what extent these civilizational elements that are being stressed actually fit into what can be defined as the teleology of socialism in China. That would be my question for you. Let me come to your paper, and I loved Xi Jinping as the general narrator of the Chinese story. You not only sort of spoke to us about narratives, but also narratology by identifying the protagonist and the audience in here. And we're all the audience in this sense. Let me just say that where intellectuals are concerned, I am a great admirer of Chinese intellectuals. I have great respect for the limits within which they work. I have many friends, just like I'm sure all of us have, who are Chinese intellectuals. I've lived and studied in China and seen the great limitations and the great risks that they take. I mean, there's a saying in China that, you know, if you're willing to suffer 100 cuts, take on the emperor. And like happened even during the 20th Party Congress, you did see a banner hung over Chen, you know, a bridge to protest the dictatorship. We want freedom. So dissenting voices right from the very beginning and discursively changing. Yeah, Alka, I mean, I think, you know, discursive changes are quite important as well. When you look at the fact that, you know, you earlier had Chung talking about peaceful rise. Now today you have Yan Tung talking about if you have power, why not exercise it? What is the point of having power if you're not going to exercise it? And Wang Hui today, who is talking about civilizational superiority, actually, of China quite clearly. Wang Hui is a traditionalist in a quite interesting fashion when we look at intellectual ideas. But I do think that there can also be no denying that the intellectual domain and the intellectual field has totally tightened under Xi Jinping. It's back to ideology to the fore, Marxism to the fore. And, you know, you have, of course, you've always had compulsory political classes in academia. But now, even if you look at, you know, what she says in the 20th Party Congress, his overall report, I did note it down somewhere, but I'm sure I won't find it now, but something to the effect that he says that academic institutions must become the breeding ground for leadership in the Communist Party. Ideological control and ideological attainment is now the primary goal. So I do see, I mean, I think we are all missing already as intellectuals in China, people, you know, who have had the privilege of going and interacting and working within China, the 2000 to 2010 period. I think that was a really, really exciting period. Some of the best work by Chinese intellectuals came out then, including some that has actually impacted policy. In many ways, one would argue that Xi's, you know, co-prosperity versus let's get rich quickly. Again, disputes in capital. Xi understands capitalism as a stage that has happened in China now. He thinks that capitalism and the development of capitalism has created the necessary productive forces for co-prosperity to start happening. So again, you see a different problematization there. But my question for you will be, you know, during the 2000-2010 period, you really did have a degree of autonomy of intellectual thought. You had a very wide number of magazines coming out. You had conferences, several of which I attended, where there was very free and open discussion. You had openly critical left-wing groups, you know, whether it's people like Wang Hui, etc., with their Tushu magazine, criticizing from the left. You had the Academy of Social Sciences criticizing from development policy, you know, in terms of Guantao, Trui, bureaucratic profiteering, etc. Very, very strong terms. And perhaps that has impacted Xi in terms of a shift from get rich quickly to co-prosper. But do you really think that all we are going to be left with now is establishment intellectuals? That would be my question. And, finally, I think, I really have absolutely nothing to add because I think that was a brilliant exposition of the very sorry state of labor in China today. I do think it is a most exploitative. I've been visiting, factories and things for a very long time, and it is very hard work. It is very hard work in China. Do you really think that they will regain, now that the goal is a xiaokang a middle-class society where you naturally don't want class war, you don't want extremes? Do you think that, like in the European context where the working class starts to vanish by becoming middle class, do you think that prosperity in China would perhaps actually transform, be transformational? There as well. Once again, thank you to all three of you for this wonderful presentation, and my special thanks to Professor Alka Acharya for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. May I request each of the presenters to briefly, respond to the comments, and then we will open the floor to the audience. Professor Acharya, please. Just briefly.
Briefly, because I think, Ravni, you gave some very interesting responses to the points I had made. So there's really not any specific question that comes along, except your point about the whole way in which civilization is sought to be integrated into the new discourse. Now, I would argue that socialism with Chinese characteristics is the discursive framework for continuing development in the Chinese context. But when we bring in this whole notion of civilization, that becomes part of a different framework which is talking about Chinese style modernization, where you bring in elements of Chinese culture and Chinese civilization. And I would say that Chinese style modernization and socialism with Chinese characteristics are two different discursive categories. One is seeking to pave the way for China eventually coming out with a China model and saying that, well, here is a Chinese style and here is a Western style or an American style or something else, but we have something which brings in elements of culture and tradition and history and civilization and all the superior kind of attributes. And socialism with Chinese characteristics is essentially a mechanism to negotiate internal challenges in a much more direct way. And that's where this whole question of labor comes to the fore. So it's not so much that capitalism has already happened, but that they have reached that level of capital accumulation which enables them to say that, like Deng Xiaoping's point was, we can't build socialism in conditions of poverty. Interestingly, Xi Jinping is saying still that we are in the primary stage of socialism. So eventually they will probably get out of the primary stage of socialism, but it gives them pretty long leeway to actually move away completely from the implementation of what constituted socialist relations of production.
And also, that's from both capitalism and socialism. They're not answerable to universal values of either. No, that I just have to use smaller side.
Okay. Yeah. Then Tuvia, please.
All right. So just to repeat, the question is: will we be only left eventually with establishment intellectuals other than Xi Jinping? So of course Xi would like nothing more than to have all the intellectuals sing in the key of Xi, as Timothy Cheek, the intellectual scholar, has been saying. But to answer your question in one word, the answer is no. In two words is absolutely not. And in a few more words is that there always were, there always have been. And actually, as a matter of fact, most of the intellectuals in China are not belonging to the establishment. They're disestablished. And on the period you talked about, the early 90s, 20 years ago, you had many journals closed down because of the authorities and censorship. But still, this is the same time where the internet started to proliferate in China. And many more intellectual scholars, think tankers, they got a new stage to, share their ideas with the world and even make a lot of money from it, by the way, by publishing books. However, I do agree, and it's really hard not to agree, that the intellectual or discursive space in China is slowly and very menacingly shrinking. And it becomes a very dangerous profession. So you can be a bungee jumper and extreme sports, but it's even more dangerous in China to be a public intellectual. So the Chinese intellectuals for years have been doing this very elegant trick, which I call an ideological sandwich, is where they say in the beginning, you know, the ideology of the time. Now it's Xi Jinping, so they always say, they begin all of their essays. We live in a time of great changes unseen in a century. They end their essay, and let's have a community of shared future for mankind. And in the middle, they say whatever the hell they want. And the same thing happened under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. The three represent harmonious society, as you mentioned. But you see, even today, even with the restriction, there's a big ideological spectrum and that was also identified by different scholars of intellectual life in China, where they talk about anything from the new left and new Marxists and the liberals and anything in between, and neoconservative, authoritarians, and so on, and new Confucians. So there is still going to be many people that are not necessarily establishment, and even when they are, they're going to air many different opinions. And finally, you'll always have the dissidents, always. So in our era, we can, you know, just pop the top of my head of Cai Xia, that's now living in the US, and she's going to speak. Okay, she's an intellectual, and her voice is heard. And Xu Zhangrun, who's being diligently translated by Jeremy Barmay from Australia. And these kind of individuals will always exist in China, and that is, I think, the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thakur, for those comments. And I mean, to move them into the middle class, that would be a very noble thought, but she also talks about promoting the the middle class, especially in his common prosperity speeches. But the problem is what he is talking about and developing them, which is becoming much more clear even in his 20th Party Congress report. He talks about in the way of self-improvement, hard work. I mean, the involvement of the state is minimal. So hard work, it's something like pulling up by bootstraps. People have to do it by themselves. So, I mean, that doesn't...
Charity is becoming the big thing. NGOs are being
Right. But the thing is, I mean, how far is state going to do that in promoting if it's actually a very feasible thing in the long run? So those all are real questions, and especially in terms of even for welfare in the workplaces, are there going to be real changes in extending worker power, or even in allowing, especially even providing space for the primary trade union? Can they be provided some autonomous space to take on some of the work managements? I do not think it's a very bleak picture.
Between their allowing trade unions in foreign entities and Chinese
That's true, but then again, even all there, that's a very correct thing. But even other than that, how much do workers feel involved in or are invested in the trade union? Many of the time, the trade union is just appointed by the management. I mean, the people in the management are sitting in the trade union. So that's one. And even in the common prosperity, they have now allowed trade unions in the gig economy. But these are not worker organizations formed from below. This is actually to be formed by the companies themselves. So who is going to be part of it? Who are the members? These are all still very fuzzy kind of thing. And I don't think it's any real with what the state is providing. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. This session starts a little bit late, so I think we still have a few minutes to take questions from the audience. So right now, please. Okay, Arvind.
So since this session is about ideas and narratives, I mean, it was wonderful to listen to 3 speakers and panelists. I have a very short question. Tuvia was talking about antagonists and protagonists, but I have a very short questions. Whenever, I'm following the recent news. In Guangzhou, Leng published his opinion about American factories laying off, workers, metaverse, then there's Amazon. This is providing narratives for Chinese to build their own stories. So this is a question to Anand and Tuvia again, how Chinese are using these narratives. This is just working like Newton's third law, right? And this is nowhere like 18-hole golf, but 100 holes golf for Xi Jinping, and he keeps changing it. In terms of ideas, narratives, how this has been used by Xi Jinping and his team to create stories or men's stories about laying off, and are they telling or creating different stories about how China is good in creating jobs, like in Chung. Those who are joining are giving extra subsidy of 1,000 RMB to 2,000 RMB. That is something new. And those also, even leaving companies, are giving extra subsidy of 2,000 to 3,000 RMB. So just this question for to both of you.
Okay, whoever. Okay, yeah. And Dr. Chen and then Tiwari. Yeah.
I have no question, but I have two comments. The first one is that Mumin Chen talking about 1985 war patent. We need to think about that Deng Xiaoping got power in 1978 December, 11届三中全会, but launched a war in 1979, China and Vietnam War. And then in 1982 is the 12th Party Congress. So I think 1985 is reasonable. And at that time, it's a real, Deng Xiaoping real got the power of the party. And the second thing is we can see the picture of this one. When you see the Deng Xiaoping take the two cats, black and white, it means socialism is broken. So China right now also say Taiwan and China have 1992 consent. Also nonsense. No consent is consent. Just like why China pretend they are socialism? Because of political requirement. They need to maintain the party-state system. We can see that any Pretoria, worker, farmer enter the 20-party Congress to ruling country, right? And Xi Jinping want to find something to replace ideology. Right now, it's just like this picture. First, expansionism, nationalism. So right now, ideology of China is nationalism, not socialism. Thank you.
Okay, so you want anyone to answer the, no? Okay, just comment, I know, yeah. Dr. Tiwari, please.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Professor Acharya. How do you view the coterminous presence of political Leninist left, which is perhaps shifting towards a Stalinist authoritarianism? An economic leadership which seems to be veering towards the Marxist left, and the presence of a cultural nationalist right in foreign policy. I mean, do these seemingly contradictory or diverging tendencies present a contradiction or synthesis? Because you were talking about dialectics earlier in terms of historical development of CCP. So that's to Professor Acharya. Second question is to Tuvia Gering. At ground level, where the public opinion is actually forming, is there a turn away from intellectual elitism towards perhaps a citizen-led knowledge creation? Alternately, if I were to rephrase this question, where do you see the countercurrents against the state-led intellectual narratives and agendas being situated? Because we know that there's been a shift in the way intellectual traditions and intellectual narratives have developed, and if we just look back from 80s to 90s to 2000s, we've seen the kind of shifts that have been marked in the presence of discursive intellectual narratives. So is there a countercurrent, if at all? And finally to Anand, you have rightly pointed out that there is an overall decline in the share in terms of workers' share in the membership and a complete takeover of elites over leadership. Would you say that labor as a focal point of both class consciousness and class solidarity has ceased to exist in the CCP? Or do you see there are any possibilities of a labor's collective outside the party now especially in terms of the availability of legal rights, law enforcement, collective bargaining, and of course the role of official trade union, that is the All China Federation of Trade Union, in terms of altering labor relations with the party. Thanks.
Okay. Now, for each presenter, please answer the questions they provide.
So very simply, Ritusha, your question about 3 different strands, okay, so there is a leftist strand, there's cultural nationalism, so on. Now, my question is that you could have different groups, different sections making different kinds of arguments within. I am more concerned with the nature of the questioning of the developmental strategy that socialism with Chinese characteristics seems to propagate. There does not seem to be any kind of opposition to the fundamental emphasis on productive forces. These different groups are merely bringing in different elements to the narrative. But it is not in terms of a fundamental questioning of that strategy which has led to such unsustainable levels of development, ecological disaster, contributing to the overall problems of the climate change issue. So I was more concerned with looking at this teleological explanation in terms of the Communist Party's essential propagation of that emphasis on productive forces and enhancement of your production base and moving further and further and further away from the relations aspect. So these dimensions really don't fundamentally make a difference to that discourse.
All right, so I'll first answer Professor Yelleri's question. Just repeat it shortly. He talked about Zhengzhou protests in Foxconn, is that right? Or the worker situation there?
The worker situation, what I was talking is what happens in the West, usually it tries to infuse building further narratives of China dream or China rejuvenation of Chinese nation. What I was talking is that these conflictual situations, like the breakdown of a slowdown of the Western economies, one. Yeah. These are the cases, or maybe the American withdrawal from the climate dialogues has given China further ways to build a narrative. So I took the example of laying off workers or maybe people from Amazon and Metaverse. That has really helped the Chinese discourse to build or maybe reinforce the discourse. So I just wanted to, how that is going to help China further.
So my first reaction to the question when you talk about workers in Zhengzhou is just thinking about the images coming out in the last week with the protests. Now, as we all know, this is where Foxconn creates all your iPhone 14s. So first, switch to Android. And second, this poses a really great challenge for the narratives of the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, as Professor Krishnan talked about the role of the laborers in the Chinese narrative and the workers, so here we have this narrative crumbling in front of our eyes in live footage. So the way they deal with these kind of situations is they censor everything, because who wants to look at these kind of things? But also, they would play on the separation between the center in Beijing and the peripheral. Here it's in the south, and they'll find a scapegoat because it breaks the narrative of China under the leadership of the Communist Party as being the ideal leader of the workers, of the proletarian too. And as for your question about where is knowledge created now, especially with the intellectual sphere becoming more restricted. So my association was, we had this toy as a kid where you had just a bag of water or beans where you just squish it and it just moves to the side a bit, but it never explodes. kind of things. So the same a bit with the Chinese knowledge space. You can squish it as much as you want, but it will pop from the sides of your hands. What I'm trying to say is the Chinese people are very innovative when it comes to creating ideas and finding platforms to air these ideas. So for example, in the period you talked about in the early 2000s, then you had all these private media come by, and then that's where you had the golden age of investigative journalism, for example. And today, when the media is becoming way more restrictive, the same thing is true for academia, and it becomes very dangerous even to air public opinions, then they find other facets to air their opinions and create knowledge, for example, in the new media, like TikTok, Douyin, and also in other places where people congregate, namely businesses, which are also huge organizations, and religion. And here I recommend the book by Ian Johnson, where he talks about the souls of China, and you can see hundreds of millions of people in China are believers, and hundreds of millions of people congregate under one roof, and that's a very big opportunity to share ideas and spread them. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Krishnan, please. Thank you. Quickly on Arvind's point, I would though see it as a contradiction. So for instance, if laying off of workers of Amazon and other corporations in the West, and if that is to be said and if that has to be refashioned in China, then this entire notion of the superiority of the socialist system, that can be called into question. So it's a very tricky thing for the Chinese to actually say. So their notion would be to have their own formulation. And in fact, here what it is also helpful is also the state is outside. So it is largely being driven between the managements of the workplaces and the labor itself. So that also helps the state to be shielded. On Rityusha's point, I would come on that is that, which I also mentioned in my presentation, is that labor is more seen by the party as something purely for economic purposes. So the social character of labor is what they want to debase and only see it as a pure economic category. And the other part is the repressive state apparatus is also in such a way in China, and also the various ways in which the party shields itself or insulates itself, especially putting it in the sense of giving all these, some of these reforms, some of these rights. Then the center party state is seen as giving all these magnanimous things, but the workers are made to feel that all the repression is being done at the local party level, and also it's the employer who is seen. So this good cop, bad cop strategy which works also keeps labor as more of an insurgency. And the other part is through all fragmentation, you can call it as class fragmentation, or you call it as there is still a need to develop consciousness. This entire notion that workers in China are a class in itself, but not a class for itself. I think that is something which is still debated by a lot of scholars of labor, and how the Chinese labor is still to get into a concept of class for itself is something missing. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. In the beginning of this session, I say that in China, ideologies and ideas shape the policies and the leaders who make decisions. But after listening to the presentations and also the comments, I also think that the ideologies and also ideas in China are also being shaped by the the incident social forces and also other also the external structures. And today in China, I think the situation we face in 2022 is very different from 1980s and 1990s. Actually, more challenges. So the China today is more like iceberg. You see, the top, but actually, if you dig deeper, and you will find more things. Yeah, and to have a comprehensive picture is quite difficult. That's why we are here. Yeah. Okay. So let's keep watch. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gentlemen, with this, session 2, Ideas and Narratives of the 5th India Forum on China at Goa comes to an end. I thank the chair, Professor Chen, the speakers, Professor Acharya, Mr. Gering, Dr. Anand, and the lead discussant, Professor Thakur. for an exceptionally enlightening and thought-provoking session. Ladies and gentlemen, may I please request you to move to the pool side for a group photograph. We shall then proceed for tea. Thank you.